Thank you for joining me again. In this segment, we will talk about the relationship between information literacy and the spiritual paradigm. Spirituality as a whole has a long history of focusing on thresholds and the liminal spaces between them. Liebert's focus on the liminal spaces, or the transitions between stages rather than the stages themselves, sets up a natural dialogue with threshold concept theory, developed by Meyer and Land, and which you may recognize as the theory from which the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy draws. Threshold concepts are essential to a nuanced and complete understanding of a discipline, cannot be unlearned, and often require a major, sometimes troublesome shift in thinking. They can also not be apprehended quickly and often can take a long time to grasp. The journey between thresholds is referred to as the liminal, which is the transitional period where learning takes place and is the focus, like Liebert's paradigm, of teaching. Meyer and Land's focus on liminal spaces between threshold concepts reflects Liebert's observations on the interrelatedness of identity, emotional, social, and intellectual growth. In fact, Meyer and Land describe threshold concepts as being, a quote, intertwined with epistemological and ontological understandings of our ways of being. They also state that, quote, such transformation may prove troublesome to certain learners for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that such transformation entails a letting go of earlier comfortable positions and encountering less familiar and sometimes disconcerting new territory. Elsewhere, Meyer and Land refer to, quote, the indissoluble interrelatedness of the learner's identity with thinking and language. In other words, threshold concepts are bound up with not just our intellectual understanding, but our entire selves and all that entails. It would seem that information literacy teaching and learning practice, which is based on the framework, would benefit from a focus of what carries a person through these liminal spaces, accompanying learners on a journey through that space toward a threshold concept. An information literacy liminal space, like that of Liebert's paradigm, involves shifting conceptions of authority, inquiry, conversation, and the nature of ourselves as co-creators and participants, rather than merely observers. There are several recommendations Liebert has made about the nature of spiritual growth, which could also be considered for information literacy teaching and learning. Conceptual and intellectual challenges. Many IL concepts deal with unlearning rules, such as reimagining citation as a guide to conversation rather than a punishable offense. Research as an inquiry process rather than a means to proving an argument, or fulfilling an assignment requirement, and evaluating sources in context rather than as good or bad. Identity challenges can include information literacy asking learners to reimagine their identities within the information ecosystem beyond the role of consumer. It also may position them to look outside of and consider news or other information sources which may have served to shape their identities to this point. Learners may come from an affinity group with a rigid orthodoxy in which certain types of questioning could serve to disaffiliate them. Asking learners to question everything, including their previous information practices and viewpoints, can present a difficult identity crisis. Authority challenges can include the fact of authority as constructed and contextual rather than absolute, can pose a difficult struggle for learners with an authoritarian outlook on the world, and especially for those whose identity or membership in a group hinges on upholding some kind of absolute authority. Self-other relationship challenges. Critical information literacy, which challenges the status quo, is disruptive by design, and as such is essential for expanding a more nuanced understanding of information. It also asks learners to think about missing voices and perspectives other than their own, or those represented in the majority of information sources. This is an awakening and a challenge for learners who are still learning to see themselves in relationship to others. These situations can be a crux or a disruption for learning, but if we are not careful, they can also backfire. How can we help facilitate these transitions? I propose it's by being aware of what students may be going through. Let's take the example of the concept, authority is constructed and contextual. I've listed some common responses from learners when asked when they consider information authoritative or why they consider information authoritative. We often hear answers which reflect traditional notions of authority, such as a source being scholarly, containing facts, being from a government website or well-known publication, or from a person whom the learner respects or agrees with, someone who holds personal authority for them. Asking them to reconsider these fixed notions of authority in the context of their information needs can be difficult. If we consider Liebert's paradigm, we can ask what some potential spiritual development related difficulties could be with this concept, rather than perceiving it as just a challenging intellectual leap. Learners with an authoritarian worldview could potentially be experiencing identity issues and a fear that arises from losing their moorings if authority is questioned. Along with that, they could potentially experience fear of questioning the orthodoxy of their identity group, which in some cases could lead to their ostracism. From a self-other perspective, they could be resisting and resenting the realization that their perspective might not be adequate or even downright wrong. This could stoke a fear of inadequacy and an insecurity of what to do about it. And they could also be not yet capable of holding ideas in tension. Paradox and uncertainty are likely to be very disruptive to a learner in early stages. Let's think about the concept of research as inquiry. We see signs of learners working through the liminal phase toward this concept when we encounter cognitive bias, binary either-or forms of argumentation, or good-bad source evaluation, patch writing, and using sources to back up arguments rather than impact arguments. Often when we are encouraging learners to take an inquiry approach to research, we are challenging the rules which they may have internalized from their previous educational experiences. These rules, which a research as inquiry frame upends, can include things like the importance of a 5-paragraph essay, the use of sources to back up a pre-existing argument, and the positioning of a learner as a contributor to the creation of new information, rather than as a passive consumer of facts. In challenging these conventions, we are often asking learners to operate from a well-developed sense of self and to balance their inner and outer authority. Other experiences which may be new for learners could be having a sense of permission to ask questions of their work and to quote unquote own library resources and tools for themselves rather than because they are required. I want to qualify this line of thinking by saying that these potential difficulties absolutely do not mean that we should not teach these things or challenge learners. Liebert's qualifier that we should not try to force stage change doesn't mean we shouldn't seek growth for learners, but it resonates with taking an informed and sensitive approach to learners with an increased awareness of the potential struggles which might serve as barriers for reaching information literacy thresholds. An awareness of potential difficulties can inform our teaching so that we can aim to help guide learners through these liminal spaces. As we think about the ways that we teach, there are a few approaches that come up that work against making the transition through the liminal. These include deficit thinking. This is a way of framing learners in the negative as being deficient in skills, concepts, abilities, motivation, potential, or preparation. This thinking ignores the abilities, knowledge, skills, and motivation that learners already bring to their learning experience. A liminal approach trusts that the learner has the potential to grow and reach thresholds and approaches teaching with this trust in place. The second is punitive grading. The use of grades as a punishment enforces practices of rule following over encouraging exploration to move beyond previously established rules to a more expansive learning experience. Any punitive approach reinforces fear and discourages forward movement through the liminal. And finally, binary good-bad delineations and checklists. This practice can downplay the nuance needed to reach thresholds and reinforce a black and white one-size-fits-all approach that reflects early stages of development. In order to support learners moving through information literacy liminal spaces, there are pedagogical practices which we can use to encourage learners to turn inward. Reflection is a key practice for processing, progressing through, and making meaning of liminality. An increased awareness of the self in relation to the processes of interacting with information is essential when moving toward more nuanced understandings of information literacy. Attention to the affective dimension of information, how it makes us feel, what type of reactions we have to it, can help us become aware of our own cognitive biases and the degrees to which we involve non-rational parts of ourselves in our decisions. This emphasis is not to downplay or overemphasize those parts, but to raise awareness of our own processes when it comes to critical thinking. It helps to shine a light on the troublesomeness of the concepts and sets the stage for working through them. Simple tasks such as pausing and making time and intention to reflect on an exercise or process can help forge connections between interaction with information and the learner's whole person. In the spirit of Liebert's qualifier of not forcing stage change, it is important that personal reflections serve the needs of the learner and that their content is not connected to performative or punitive measures, such as grades, which discourage authentic, honest reflection. It is also important to not demand vulnerability and sharing from learners who may not feel safe doing so for a variety of reasons. The process is important, however, and can be considered in several ways for integrating into information literacy teaching and learning. And finally, let's look back to Liebert for an idea of what the goal of spiritual and whole person growth could look like. Although no person ever stops growing, we can imagine what someone in the full integrated stage might reflect. Liebert quotes two authors with complementary descriptions. The first is from Fowler and imagines that an integrated person would be activists who make tangible the imperatives of love and justice. They are heedless of their own self-preservation as they redefine the usual criteria of normality and subvert limited and limiting social structures. Their communities and their compassion are universal in extent. And the second, from Helminiak, imagines that an integrated person would be alive to the present moment and in touch with the very depths of themselves, living in a deep harmony between themselves and all that is. These definitions resonate with the goals that we often see for the processes of higher education, especially in liberal arts contexts, which imagine graduates to be compassionate and productive global citizens with values and actions which benefit their communities. Like all visionary goals, getting there takes a long time, sometimes even a lifetime. With an intentional focus and care for the spiritual dimension of information literacy learners and learning, we can help facilitate the kind of integrated thinking and living that makes all of us more whole and more connected to others and the world around us. Thank you so much.